money, power, empire. For more than 3 centuries, these 3 words defined the world, and at the center of it all stood one force, the British Empire. It wasn't just an empire of red flags and navy ships, it was an empire of extraction, a global machine built not on honor or civilization, but on economics. The British didn't simply conquer land, they conquered wealth. From the 17th century to the early 20th, Britain transformed the world into a single economic system, designed entirely for its own benefit. While maps showed colonies shaded in red, the true color of the empire was gold. The blueprint of control. The British understood something earlier empires never did. Control the economy and you control everything else. So they built a system, one that combined military power, trade monopolies, and financial dominance. Every colony, from India to Africa to the Caribbean, was part of a vast web with one purpose, to feed Britain's industries. Raw materials flowed in, finished goods flowed out. India sent cotton, jute, tea, and opium. The Caribbean sent sugar and rum. Africa supplied gold, diamonds, and labor. In return, Britain sent cloth, steel, and manufactured goods, often back to the same people they had taken resources from. It wasn't trade, it was an economic loop designed to keep the colonies dependent forever. The Industrial Revolution's fuel. The British Industrial Revolution didn't happen in isolation. It was financed, fed, and fueled by colonial wealth. Cotton from India and the American South powered Manchester's textile mills. Sugar profits from the Caribbean funded banks and railways in London. The capital that built the factories in Birmingham came from the sweat of Indian farmers and enslaved Africans. Britain industrialized because others were deindustrialized. In India, centuries-old textile centers like Dhaka and Murshidabad collapsed as cheap British cloth flooded the market. Local weavers went bankrupt. Millions of artisans lost their livelihoods. Britain called it progress. For Indians, it was economic devastation. The mechanics of exploitation. Colonial economies were built on a simple formula: extract, export, exploit. The British imposed taxes on local farmers, forcing them to grow cash crops, indigo, cotton, and opium, instead of food. These crops were shipped to British factories and markets, while the locals went hungry. When famines hit India, grain exports continued because profit mattered more than people. Between 1870 and 1900 alone, over 30 million Indians died in famine under British rule, even as India exported record amounts of wheat and rice to Britain. In Africa, it was worse. Entire communities were forced into labor to build roads, mines, and railways, not for development, but for extraction. The Congo's rubber, South Africa's gold, Nigeria's palm oil all became gears in the imperial machine. Colonial subjects didn't participate in the economy. They were the economy. The empire's economic power wasn't just physical, it was financial. Britain introduced its own currencies across colonies: rupees, pounds, shillings, all tied to the British pound sterling. This wasn't convenience, it was control. By tying colonial money to London's banking system, Britain controlled exchange rates, prices, and trade flows. Colonial banks were not built to serve locals, they served the empire. The East India Company, the Bank of England, and dozens of trading houses turned the colonies into financial satellites. Every major decision, from tax policy to interest rates, was made in London. The colonies had no independent economies. They were extensions of British capitalism. Even the railways, often praised as gifts of progress, were built to transport resources out of colonies, not to connect local communities. The myth of civilizing trade. To justify this massive economic drain, Britain crafted a narrative that colonialism brought civilization, modernity, and trade. But behind the polished speeches was a brutal reality. The empire's civilizing mission was an accounting trick. British officials claimed they built schools, roads, and hospitals, yet for every pound invested in a colony, 5 were extracted. India's GDP share in the world economy dropped from 23% in 1700 to just 3% by 1947. Britain's share, meanwhile, skyrocketed. Colonialism didn't spread prosperity, it concentrated it. The empire was, in essence, a wealth transfer machine. Gold, silver, and raw materials moved west. Poverty, famine, and debt moved east and south. Behind every pound earned by the empire was human suffering. Slavery and indentured labor were the engines that made it work. From Caribbean sugar plantations to African mines, millions were enslaved, displaced, or worked to death. When slavery was finally abolished, the British government didn't compensate the victims. They compensated the slave owners. The total payment was so huge that British taxpayers only finished paying it off in 2015.
Think about that. The cost of human freedom was treated as a financial loss. Even after slavery, economic bondage continued in new forms. Taxes, forced labor, and unequal trade agreements kept colonies under control. The names changed, the exploitation didn't. The global financial empire. By the late 19th century, Britain wasn't just the world's workshop, it was its banker. The city of London became the heart of global finance. Insurance companies, shipping firms, and trading banks all revolved around one currency, the pound sterling. Half the world's trade was invoiced in it. This financial dominance allowed Britain to shape global prices, dictate interest rates, and manipulate markets to its advantage. Even countries outside the empire couldn't escape its influence because London controlled the flow of global capital. In a sense, colonialism had evolved from armies to algorithms long before the digital age. Resistance and rebellion. But exploitation never goes unchallenged. Across the colonies, people began to see through the economic illusion. Indian nationalists like Dadabhai Naoroji exposed the drain of wealth, showing how billions were extracted every year. In Africa, leaders demanded fair trade instead of forced labor. In the Caribbean, workers organized strikes that shook plantation economies. Economic resistance became political revolution. Because once people realized that freedom without financial independence is just another form of slavery, the empire's foundations began to crack. The end of empire and its shadow. When the British Empire finally began to crumble after World War II, its economic system didn't vanish, it simply changed shape. The former colonies became developing nations, still exporting raw materials, still importing finished goods, still trapped in global debt. Multinational corporations replaced colonial governors. The International Monetary Fund and World Bank took the place of imperial banks. The empire had ended in name, but not in structure. Even today, trade routes, financial systems, and global institutions still carry the blueprint of empire. Countries that once supplied resources now struggle under loans and unequal trade terms. The global south remains a producer of raw materials for industries in the north. The direction of wealth still flows the same way. So what did the British Empire really build? Railways, ports, or parliaments? No. It built a global economy designed to serve the few at the cost of the many. An economy where profit outranked humanity and where the illusion of progress masked centuries of plunder. But understanding that truth is power, because the first step to breaking free from any system is to see it clearly. The colonial economy wasn't just history, it's the foundation of our modern world. Every time a developing country struggles with debt, or faces unfair trade, or watches its resources extracted for foreign profit, the echoes of empire are still there. The British Empire may be gone, but its economic shadow still rules the world.